Hello class, in this tutorial I'd like to give you an introduction to HTML and CSS layout. So as you're beginning to build your first website, probably going to look something like this here with some links. You might start to think, well, how do I begin to lay this page out with a little more structure and a little more design? And that's where CSS is going to come in, obviously. So what I want to do in this tutorial is just give you an introduction to the different ways you can begin to lay your page out, especially if you're beginning, because this is where it gets a little bit complicated. And it's not going to be exactly a step-by-step tutorial and say, do this, and then you start to create the layout. This is going to be more of an overview of the different sites that you can begin to create based on w3schools.com. And then the kind of step-by-step tutorials on CSS layout and responsive design will start next week. That's going to be my plan anyway, because it is a very large topic and it can be overwhelming, I think, to begin to move into that. So first of all, let me talk about the HTML links that you're working on, and then we will look specifically at the ones that can help you begin to apply some layout and some structure to your pages, begin to make them look a little bit better. So I did assign quite a few links from the HTML5 tutorial on W3 Schools. This is like our textbook. So you probably made it through, I don't know, maybe half of those. If you looked at them closely and you tried them out, you'll probably see that a lot of them are very quick. You just say, well, there's HTML paragraphs. Okay, try that out. Styles, yeah, there's a property and a value there, background color. So a lot of those tutorials go really quickly. And then you get down to like HTML CSS, and it gets a little bit confusing. So this would be the first one that you want to work on, that you really need to have some background on before you start in on layout. So when you're talking about CSS, there's going to be three different types here that we're going to use this semester. There's inline, and you probably tried that already, where you're including actually some CSS within HTML tags, like within the paragraph tag or the heading, to change the look of that specific tag. Now, eventually, you're probably not going to use that as much because that's just the basic thing you start with. Internal is what we're going to be working on in the next couple weeks, and then we're going to add in external. These two are actually pretty similar as far as the CSS that you will write and include on your site. It's just that the external puts all of your CSS in one file, a .css file. So we'll get into that on the next week or two. But this is the page you want to start with. Read through this and kind of see what they're talking about. So if you look at the internal CSS, this is probably where you're going to focus your attention for the first week or two as you're learning CSS. You don't have to worry about putting it in a separate style sheet. Once you get some of the basics down with the internal CSS, then you can move what you're doing here in the code to an outside external CSS style sheet. So that's where we'll head with that. You can see it actually links to a styles.css. Now the benefit of that is that you can use one style sheet for all of your HTML pages. So then you make one change, like maybe you want to change the background color or the font. You make one change in that style sheet, and then it changes every single HTML page that uses this link. So that's eventually where we're going to go. But just trying out the layout, you can just use the inline here and put it, or the internal, and put it directly in the code. So that's the first one you want to look at. I'll come back and do another tutorial on links once we get some of the layout in, because there's quite a bit to CSS links and changing the colors and creating little rollovers and active, things like that. So let's see, we can skip tables now. You can look at blocks, and blocks are one way that you can start to lay out your page with division tags, and you can apply CSS to division tags. Now, division tag by itself does absolutely nothing, but then when you start to add in the CSS styles, you can create like divs that are a certain width and height, or have a border or background, and begin to get some layout. So that's one way that you can lay out your pages. And then when you look down here, you'll see an HTML layout, and this gives you probably the most basic example of what an HTML layout looks like. So this, I guess, is where I would recommend that you start. We'll take this in the tutorial, and I'll take the code and apply it to one of these pages here. There's also an HTML responsive, and responsive design is something that we're going to focus on quite a bit this semester. but realize that it is pretty complicated. That's design that fits in any size screen, which is one thing you really want to start paying attention to as you learn how to design your sites. So let's go back to HTML layout, and I'll take you through a few of these examples here. Now, one thing I will mention is that with the CSS tutorials, I'll show you one page from that tutorial today, but I'll assign that tutorial next week. If you're working ahead, you can go into the basic CSS tutorial and start on it, but I'll show you just one thing here, the box model, in a second. Okay, but let me go to, let's see, back to Learn HTML, and let me go to HTML Layout on the left-hand page. And you'll see that this is probably about the most basic layout you can get. It's got a header area, left-hand menu, a place for some content, and then a footer at the bottom. And then there's a try it yourself if you want to get the code. So if you scroll down here, a couple things that you want to pay attention to. First off is that HTML has layout elements built into it, HTML5. So that means that you can actually name these sections of your page and then apply CSS to control those sections. So this is one good way to start laying out your page. It's got the header, navigation, different sections, article, and a side, kind of like a sidebar and footer, and then there's also details and a summary, which you may or may not need in there. But this is a pretty typical HTML layout, so those are called like sectional layouts. And you'll see some other techniques here, HTML layout techniques. And HTML tables is the way everyone used to lay out pages probably 15-20 years ago. And then CSS came and took over with division tags. And division tags, strictly using division tags for your layout is a little outdated, so now there are new tags. There's a Flexbox, there are a lot of frameworks out there. There's things like Bootstrap you may have heard of that are pre-built frameworks for responsive design. And then if you get into something like WordPress, which is a content management system, or even what they're doing with like Wix or Squarespace or a lot of the hosting companies, all of that's going to use CSS, and you can get in and customize the CSS with those particular technologies, but everything is done through a browser designed so that you don't have to work with the code. But just keep in mind that pretty much all of those technologies, different websites, for the layout, they use CSS as the back end. That's going to be the primary code that you'll see. So you say, well, which one do I choose? It's going to give you some hints here. You know, don't use tables, obviously. You can use a CSS framework, like there's a w3.css and there's Bootstrap. So you could do that. Now those are hard to customize and they've got some drawbacks. The code is really hard to get in there and really work with. So, you know, usually starting out, I don't recommend using a framework that's already built for you. There's a CSS Floats. This one is fine to use. And then there's also the Flexbox. That's probably the one that we'll focus on. It doesn't have many drawbacks. I mean, there's an IE10 or earlier problem with it. But in general, you know, that's what HTML5 is designed for, to use this Flexbox. So it works for responsive design. So if you did want to experiment with this yourself after you're comfortable with everything up to this point, then you can click on Try It Yourself. And one nice thing about this is that everything is in one HTML file, so you don't have to worry about a lot of code to make this happen, and you can copy and paste and experiment. So if I wanted to copy and paste this into one of my pages and just kind of see what it's all about, I could go over here to my website, and let's say I just want to you know, duplicate the index.html file and practice on it. So I'll just hit you know, copy paste on it. Let's use the shortcuts. All right, let me rename it, and I'm going to say, I'll say layout. It's just going to be practice. Put it back in my folder, and then I'll go ahead and open it up right here. And now I'm working on layout, so I'm not going to ruin any of my my other HTML pages. And now I can just kind of copy and paste and see. So when you're talking about an inline style, you'll see a style tag right here. So here's all the CSS code. Now again, this tutorial is just an intro, so I'm not going to go through these one by one. I'm just going to implement this into my site so I can practice with it a little bit and kind of see what things do. But again, I'll start a little more detailed tutorial series next week on CSS layout. So what I might want to do here is get everything underneath the title. So I'll start with the meta character set and the viewport and then the style. I'll scroll on down. I'm just going to copy this where the style tag closes right here. So I'll just copy. and then that's in the head of the document. So over here, if you want to insert that, you would just make some space, and then the style tag and all the tags I just copied, they go in the head of your document, just like that. Okay, and then obviously you would also need the layout tags, because if you look through these tags, you'll see that they have names. So there is the header, there's the section, the navigation. So if I don't have those tags on my page, then it's not going to work. Now I have a little bit of content that's already on here, and what I'll do is just put it above that, and I'll leave my content there, and then if I wanted to start filling in a little bit with my current content, I could do that. But I'll put it underneath the body tag right there, and I'll just get their HTML and see if it works. So notice when I'm getting this HTML right here, I'll copy everything between the body tags. So you'll see, and let's see, actually I'll start with the header right here. So it starts with the header. You'll see section, you'll see navigation, article, and then closing tags and a footer at the bottom. Okay, so that's all the HTML tag you have to get if you want to see if this will work. Alright, so now let me come over here, and right here I'm going to right click and paste. Alright, so I've got that inside the body tag. Everything looks pretty good. Not sure where that bracket came from. Might cause a problem. Alright, now let's do a file save. And then I'll come back over here to my site and take my layout, drop it in here. Alright, and you can see what I have now. So I just took the code that they have, and now I've got a little layout at the top. So if I wanted to start dropping in my content, pictures, changing around the colors, I could do that. That's one good way to learn as you are beginning. It's kind of like reverse engineering. So you put it in there, and then you sort of break it down and say, well, what do these numbers do here? You know, what happens if I change around padding, make that a little bit less? So if I do want to try something like that, so there's background color. So let me add in some more hexadecimals to that and see what changes. Let me take some of the padding down in size. Okay, I'm just scrolling through here. I don't really need to do anything with the navigation menu with these right now, unless maybe I want it to be a little smaller, so I could take the padding down there. Scrolling down again, there's another background color. So let's see what happens if I add in some more numbers to the hexadecimal. Again, padding right here. This is like a responsive design, so it gives me a responsive layout, which I don't need to do anything with right now, but it gives me a max width of what's going to happen, and it tells me that it's going to be turned into columns on smaller screens. So I'll test that out in a second. Let me do a file save. Back over here and refresh. You can see that some of the colors changed and the site got a little bit smaller. Let me take this and drag it. Alright, and there is where it changes into one column for the responsive design. Now for this one, the size of the header is based on the font size and then also the padding. So if I took this down and just say I don't want any padding on there, I'll just put it at 0 right now, and I'll take the font size down a little bit. Again, I'll save, come over here and refresh. You can see that the header does now get smaller. And you can put a height on these as well if you want. So if I say, well, I just want to go ahead and designate this is going to be, I don't know, 20 pixels high. So I'll just type this in. If I can spell height, equals, colon, 1 space, and we'll do 20 pixels, just like that. File save, refresh. Alright, and there is what 20 pixels looks like. That's pretty small. So let's take this out and say 200. File save. Just like that. So you can see different ways you can begin to start affecting the layout of your pages. And what I would recommend here at this point, I'll probably cut this tutorial off because it's getting kind of long. Just a couple more things here. So if you wanted to experiment with this, you can try the Flexbox example just like I did. Incorporate the code into your site and then see what that does. I wouldn't really go into HTML responsive design yet. Over here in CSS, if you scroll down, you'll see the box model. And this is one that was sort of like the first way that people designed sites using CSS. And it's kind of similar to what I just showed you here, but instead of using the different sections like called header, you just call it a division tag, and then you assign an ID to that when you're controlling different sections of your page. So that's something that maybe we'll get into next week. It's a way that you probably are not going to use to design your entire website anymore, but it used to be what people used only for design, only for layout. So I wanted to mention that. And let me go back to the HTML layout page here. So you will see on underneath the CSS Flexbox, there's a link to a CSS Flexbox chapter. That's in the advanced CSS, so it's not something we're going to get into quite yet. It goes into a lot more of the properties and kind of a lot more about how this works. But basically, the Flexbox is designed to make it easier to develop a flexible, responsive layout instead of just using the block and the division tags. So that's one thing that we're going to look at. But there's quite a bit here with the HTML and CSS tutorials, so we're going to spend a lot of time in the course on those two links and all the different tutorials. Alright, well that's it for this video.